Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another legal breaking reporting and video analysis update. As you all are aware, Oregon officials of the state of Oregon and the city of Portland had filed a lawsuit requesting and seeking a temporary restraining order, or in legalese, a temporary restraining order, or TRO, against Donald Trump and his regime, and him and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, former Fox News host, from illegally sending in the National Guard to the streets of Portland to fight, quote, wars ravaged. That is a flat out lie, ladies and gentlemen. There is no war currently going on in the streets of Portland. There is no rebellion, and there is sure as hell is no insurrection. There are people down there that are currently reporting on the matter, to which are both mainstream media influencers and mainstream media influencers such as myself. I am one of the independent media influencers. I am not down there, but I am one of them. Let's get into this new reporting, ladies and gentlemen, and this update on the case. The article, ladies and gentlemen, is titled, "Federal Judge Blocks Trump from Deploying Oregon National Guard to Portland." The order stops Trump's and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's plan to deploy 200 Oregon Guard troops to Portland to guard federal buildings. Ladies and gentlemen, the article reads, "A federal judge has temporarily blocked President Donald Trump from federalizing and deploying Oregon National Guard troops to Portland following a challenge from the state and the city of Portland. Judge Karin Immergut of the U.S. District Court in Portland granted the city and the Oregon Department of Justice a temporary restraining order Saturday afternoon, stopping for now the ladies and gentlemen, Trump's and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's plan to deploy 200 Oregon National Guard troops to Portland to guard federal buildings. The order expires October 18, and the parties will discuss October 17 whether the order should be extended for another 2 weeks. Federal lawyers have until October 17 to argue for a preliminary injunction to block the temporary restraining order. In her 30-page opinion, Immergut issued a powerful rebuke of Trump's perception of his executive power and found he violated the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees police power within the states. Resides with the states. Immergut said protests in Portland were not by any definition a rebellion, nor do they pose the danger of a rebellion. Furthermore, this country has a long-standing and foundational tradition of resistance to government overreach, especially in the form of military intrusion into civil affairs. Immergut wrote, "This historical tradition boils down to a simple proposition. This is a nation of constitutional law, not martial law. Defendants have made a range of arguments that, if accepted, risk blurring the line between civil and military federal power to the detriment of this nation. Oregon Guard members have in recent days been training at Camp Riley in Warrenton in preparation for a potential activation to Portland." Oregon Governor Tina Kotek, in a statement Saturday evening, said the ruling meant the truth has prevailed. "There is no insurrection in Portland," Kotek continued. "No threat to national security. No fires, no bombs, no fatalities due to civil unrest. The city only threat the only threat we face is to our democracy, and it is being led by President Donald Trump." Oregon's senior U.S. Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat, said in a statement, "Trump was provoking, not quelling conflict by trying to deploy federal troops. I will keep working with local and state officials to ensure Trump does not keep wasting millions of taxpayer dollars to make Portland the center of his perverse fantasy about conducting assaults on U.S. cities." Wyden said. Trump, at a Tuesday speech with military leaders, said, quote, "We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds," unquote, for the U.S. military. In the same meeting, he described Portland as like World War II. By Saturday morning, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said Trump had notified him that he would soon federalize 300 National Guard troops in Illinois to guard federal property in Chicago against Pritzker's wishes. It's unclear yet what hearing Immergut's ruling in Oregon could have on any lawsuits brought against Trump in Illinois over the attempted deployment there. Trump has claimed in ladies and gentlemen, posts on his social media platform, site, Truth Social, that the ICE processing facility south of downtown Portland is under attack by anti-fascists and domestic terrorists. He used the site to announce on September 27 that he'd attempt to deploy troops to Portland. The facility has drawn weekly protests of just a couple dozen people in recent months, and they have remained mostly peaceful. The local U.S. attorney has brought charges against 26 people since early June for crimes at the protest site, including arson and resisting arrest. Protests ladies and gentlemen, last weekend ladies and gentlemen, grew to a couple hundred following Trump's calls for federal reinforcement. The protests have stayed mostly peaceful, with Portland police arresting several men throughout the week for fighting, including a right-wing influencer, according to reporting in the Oregonian. The U.S. Justice Department said Friday it's launching an investigation into the Portland Police Bureau over the influencer's arrest. On Saturday, as hundreds of protesters protested, ladies and gentlemen, over at the ICE facility, federal agents used chemical sprays on the crowd, and several people were arrested, according to reporting from Oregon Public Broadcasting. In a 2-hour hearing over the temporary restraining order Friday, Senior Assistant Oregon Attorney General Scott Kennedy called the attempted federal deployment one of the most dramatic infringements on state sovereignty in Oregon's history, unquote. Eric Hamilton, a lawyer for the federal government, called protesters outside the ICE facility in Portland vicious and cruel, and said federal police, ICE agents, and Department of Homeland Security agents were overworked and needed guard reinforcement. State Attorney General Dan Rayfield requested the restraining order motion on behalf of the state and the city of Portland as part of their broader lawsuit filed against Trump. Hegseth, ladies and gentlemen, Hegseth, U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, the ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. That suit also filed in U.S. court. Ladies and gentlemen, U.S. District Court in Portland alleges the federal leaders and their agencies by attempting to send troops to Portland are violating the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees police power within states resides within the states. They also allege the federal government is violating the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally prohibits military members from conducting domestic law enforcement. The state and Portland also allege the city is being singled out for political retaliation.